Welcome, everybody, to another episode in the TAN YouTube series entitled Wisdom with Our Fathers. My name is Connor Gallagher. I'm publisher of TAN Books, the publisher you can trust with your faith, the publisher that will help you become a saint. And the topic today, I think, is particularly tied to this notion of becoming a saint. You see, because every single thing you do in life, whether it is praying in adoration or digging a ditch or going to work or shooting hoops in the backyard with the kids, every single thing is meant to help us become a saint. And if the thing you're thinking about or doing is not helping you become a saint, then, well, it's a complete and utter waste of time. And I mean that literally. So this is certainly not meaning that everyone is called to be a contemplative monk living in mental prayer, or that everybody is meant to self-flagellate or do extreme fasting, or everybody's meant to go out to the jungle and evangelize. But every person is called to seek sainthood through every single act that they take, including those times when it doesn't feel like we're doing anything saintly. Anything. Like I went fishing this morning with my kids. We were on a boat just about an hour. I was on a boat about an hour ago. And even that, where it's relaxation, it's a little time off. It's not the drudgery of the normal workday, but it's supposed to help me become a saint. So today's topic is about leisure, Catholic leisure. And even leisure is meant to help us elevate our souls and our minds to God. And to help us with this topic today is a priest of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, also known as FSSP. And he's with us all the way from Mexico today. Thank God for cyberspace. We're able to do things like this. Imagine Ignatius of Loyola being able to do this all throughout the world. So we're very pleased to have Father Daniel Heenan with us. And thank you very much, Father, for being with us.
It's an honor. Thank you for inviting me.
Before we jump in our topic on the subject of leisure and how I think leisure should help us become saints, as I was saying, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, and your priestly ministry.
Thank you. I've been a priest for almost 6 years. Was ordained in 2014. And ever since, I've been working at the FSSP's mission apostolate in Guadalajara in the state of Jalisco in Mexico. 3 years ago, I was made the pastor, so I'm here with 2 other priests. It's been a really interesting place to be a priest, working in a different culture than I'm used to, but a culture that's very rich with Catholic traditions. It's always something new to learn.
Well, that's great. And in support of your ministry, we're going to make sure we put a link in our show description to where our viewers who are watching now, or certainly the most viewers come well after the show when it's placed on YouTube. So I encourage all of viewers today or in the future to go to that link and make a generous donation for the great work that Father Heenan's doing. So great. Well, thanks for that introduction. And we were noticing that we had a few things that, paths that crossed in the past. We both were students for a while at Catholic University. Yeah. We both have many mutual friends. So it's a wonderful little small Catholic world.
It is.
So it's nice to get to know you a little better. Let me ask you, Father, before we jump in and use the word leisure a little bit more and kind of dig into that, let's talk about work. Let's talk about kind of the other side of the coin, if you will, or at least how we use the words. You've heard a lot of confessions, I'm sure, in your time, but how often do you hear people confess being a workaholic, being addicted to productivity, efficiency? Because in my own life and in examining the life of others that I'm close to, Boy, I see that it's a challenge. I see that especially us Americans, and maybe it's different where you're sitting right now in Mexico. I'd be interested to know if there is a difference. But I think the old saying is Americans live to work, and maybe Europeans work to live,
Right.
something like that. But maybe that's more true in South America even than Europe. I don't know, but I just get the sense that before we talk about leisure, we need to talk about work and what it is, what it is supposed to be, and how we abuse it. Because from my perspective, I think we overwork, and we place way too much emphasis on he or she who works the hardest, works the fastest, which is often counterproductive, let alone spiritually harmful. So what do you have to say about that?
That's a very interesting question, because I do think the perception in Latin cultures is very different than in the United States, and many people here are very aware of it. There's the stereotype that's very common, that the American tends to be a workaholic, and it makes me think of Mother Teresa. She in one of her books, or some reflection, she comments on how when Westerners would come to India, where she was working, some of them would get very frustrated seeing people just sitting under a tree or sitting on a porch, and say, why are they more productive? There's obviously a balance, because I've been to certain places where we could say there's an excess of lack of productivity. And isn't that interesting that St. Thomas always says that the virtue's in the middle, right? So we can sin by excess of leisure, which would be never doing anything productive, and we can sin by a defect as well, and both are sins. So as we know, work is supposed to sanctify us. If we look at right from the beginning, when God punishes Adam and Eve for their sin, one of the things he says to Adam is that he will have to earn his sustenance by the sweat of his brow. Yeah. So by accepting humbly the punishment that God imposes, we sanctify ourselves. However, we shouldn't think that work is only like that Adam was just going to sit there all day, because he was supposed to till the garden. He was supposed to tend to creation even before the fall. It's just that the work became more difficult and painful after the fall. So there's something in man that needs to harness creation, or needs to not harness, because it implies dominance and maybe in the wrong way, but he needs to work the creation as part of his process of sanctification.
Harvest the creation, bring it to its full fruition.
That's right. That's a good way to put it.
So again, before I jump into leisure and ask you to define that, I got another question that's in my mind very similar: the sin of sloth. Mm-hmm. Now, because I think a lot of people might confuse sloth with leisure. So I'm sort of going via negativa to get to leisure. So sloth, I worked on a little book called Still Amidst the Storm, and it was given out to lots of parishes this past year, and it's been rather well received. Certainly not because the author wrote any great sentences or anything, but the subject matter is just spot on with what's needed in culture. We have too much emphasis on productivity and efficiency, as we were just talking about, but the spiritual result of that, I talk about in my little book, is that we develop the sin of sloth. And people think of a sloth like the animal, a sloth, moving slow, a couch potato, sitting there not getting anything done. But I call a lot of the world that I've lived in the past, or look at around the area I used to live, as Yuppieville. And Yuppieville is these people, they're just completely addicted to staying so busy. Their whole life is like a big ball of nervous energy. And they need their kids to be on every travel team possible, and they need their kids to get into Chapel Hill or Duke. And they themselves have to squeeze in yoga before having, Starbucks coffee with their friends, and they're stressed out because they're so busy.
Yeah.
And so but what they lack is any sense of spiritual appreciation. For example, if you're so busy being a productive person that you have no desire to go to church on Sunday, you have the sin of sloth. So I found that because sloth is defined by Aquinas as a sorrow for spiritual goods. And we often get that sorrow for spiritual goods because we have so much excitement for earthly goods, material goods, and we wear ourselves out. So talk to us a little bit about the sin of sloth and how that could actually creep in through busyness as opposed to just laying around on the couch all day.
That's right. Well, sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins, the capital sins, which means that more so than being a concrete sin in itself, it's the cause of many other sins. So it's really interesting when we open up Thomas Aquinas and we see how he delineates the daughters of the different capital sins, and also their contrary virtues. It sometimes surprises us how we think about it, because I think you're absolutely right. A lot of times when we say sloth, people are going to think, oh, it's just laziness. But it has a deeper spiritual reality. We can have laziness that is a rejection of what requires a physical exertion, okay? And that's maybe a bodily condition. It could have lots of causes. But it could also originate in the soul, and it could be intellectual, right? So we could despair of achieving the end. And so that's why really sloth is the contrary vice of the virtue of hope. It's an observation Joseph Pieper has in his book on the theological virtues. And he says that many people would think that the opposite of sloth would be diligence. And if you think that, you might easily fall into the idea of, well, just hyperactivity is the way to prevent sloth.
Right.
And we can say something later about the value of discipline as a remedy to sloth. But really, we need to understand what the virtue of hope gives us. That we have a final cause. That is, we're called to be saints. But not only that, but that it's possible, right? So the virtue of hope gives us confidence that God's going to give us all the means necessary to achieve that end. But when we fall into sloth, either we're going to despair of the end. We think, that's not for me. That's for somebody else. Or we're going to look at all the steps we have to get there. And in the Summa, actually, St. Thomas describes, he gives different opinions on derivatives of sloth. And he talks about how some, they distract themselves with other supposed or relative goods instead of pursuing the ultimate good, or they fall into a certain malice against those who remind them of what their final cause is, because they don't want to hear about it. It's easier to ignore it, right? So there's a whole bunch of things to be aware of there. And I think in our modern age of so much productivity, we have to be particularly aware of the frenzy that is a form of sloth, because if I keep busy all the time, well, then I don't ever have to think about, I better go to confession.
Right. Well, I liken it to the devil's Trojan horse. So, in the great Greek epics, the Trojan horse hides in its belly is hidden the Greek soldiers that bring down the city of Troy. And so this big Trojan horse is rolled in through the walls of Troy, and then the soldiers are hiding in there and they drop down, they slaughter everybody. The big Trojan horse is busyness and productivity, and it's being slid into our culture. But what's hiding in it is sloth or sloth, that this sorrow for spiritual goods to where we're so worn out we don't even seek God even in our spare time, which brings me to leisure then. So what is leisure? I have some ideas, and it's been a long time since I read Joseph Pieper's book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. I was probably too young to even understand it anyway, but I need to go back after this. I'm going to go back and read it. But what is it? Is it vacation? Is it just time off? Is it a Catholic version of laziness? I mean, what is leisure?
Yeah, I think the best way to consider it in its true sense is a contemplative disposition, right? An ability to rest in God, right? So contemplation is our ultimate goal, right? We all are called to be saints, which means contemplating God in heaven, and that means being at rest, right? God has to be the primary operator in the act of contemplation. And so in this life, a healthy leisure is a resting in something that exists for its own sake, or oriented towards something that exists for its own sake. And we could maybe distinguish it with utilitarian activity, something that always has to serve some other purpose, whereas a true leisure is good for its own sake.
I love that, Father. You're talking about rest, and I'm going to butcher this, but I think it's Matthew 12 is coming to mind. But learn of me, for I am meek and humble of heart. Take my yoke upon you, and you shall find rest for your souls. He doesn't say rest for your bodies. And when I read that passage, and I think he's talking to a people that have been trampled by the Romans, who are dying of malnutrition, who have persecution, who are met in the temple by sanctimonious rabbis who condemn them and look down upon them for chipping the slightest edge of the law. And then Jesus here, amidst all of that anxiety, says, I put my yoke upon you, pick up your cross and carry it, and you'll find rest for your souls. So that's interesting. You're talking about leisure being almost a contemplative act. How do we get this rest for our souls? Because we need it. I mean, we are, as going back to what we were talking about 15 minutes ago, we're a workaholic nation. We work so much, and we really do need leisure. One of the things my dad often does, he's my boss, and he makes me take time off. He knows I need it.
I need someone to do that for
me. I'll work myself to the bone. And it's not healthy. So let's talk a little bit more about this. How do I go about having a contemplative mindset towards our Lord, so that I do find rest and actually get rejuvenated, so I can go back out into the world and go back to battle?
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that the idea of rest has a purpose or a function. For instance, St. Thomas tells us that it's impossible for us to be on our knees all day praying, right? So we need a certain amount of rest, both of body and mind, in order to return to that sort of work, right? The spiritual work. So on a practical level, we have to recognize our weaknesses, which is an act of humility, because I think that enters into our frenzy that we think, well, if I don't do this, nobody will, or it all depends on me. And we have to be able to say, no, actually, it all depends on God. And that's why the idea of rest is really written into salvation history, because the first covenant with man is the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is to rest. God finished his work and he rested. And then we have to guard the Sabbath in order to rest, because that's our ultimate destiny. And it's a real test to be able to do that, to surrender, and say that, you know what, it's going to be better for me if I admit that this depends more on God. You know, if God doesn't build the house, you know, they labor in vain, as the song says.
Yeah.
So first, we need that humility in order to recognize that, we can step away and put God in control. And then we need to have a delight for the things of the Spirit, which we can only experience in a restful, contemplative state. And I'm not just talking about, you know, levitation and visions and mystical prayer, but, you know, intellectual delights and enriching the spirit. You have to cultivate a sensibility to it.
The book Abandonment to Divine Providence, a great book by Jean-Pierre de Caussade. I've been rereading it recently, and the first couple chapters he talks about fulfilling the duties of your station in life. That's one of the ways you abandon yourself to God's will, is by doing your duties. And he says that there's a proactive abandonment, which is going out and doing your job. But then there's a passive abandonment, which is accepting whatever God sends your way and knowing that the outcome of a lot of this work, or knowing that a pandemic that's sent your way that you can't control, is in one form or another God's will for you. And so therefore not stressing about it. He doesn't use stress, but you know, what you were saying there is, you know, having this contemplative sense that God is the one in control. But if our best efforts are not producing the results that we want them to produce, shouldn't we chill out and understand that God is the one in control, and he will or will not, you know, produce these results that we're hoping to get? But it is within God's power to do so or not. And I guess it goes back to the old saying, you know, work like everything depends on you, but pray like everything depends on God. And it's in that harmonious approach with work and prayer that we can find peace and rest in our soul, because we know it does not depend on us. It depends on God's holy providence. Yeah.
I think people are probably, or hopefully, with this whole situation, with quarantines and everything, perhaps can come to a better appreciation of it, right? Formerly, a sense of rest was built into the fabric of society when we respected the Lord's Day. You know, I like to point out that on a civil holiday, like here in Mexico, they have the birthday of Benito Juarez, for instance, and it's a Monday and everything's closed, right? But on Sunday, everything's open and people are buying and selling and not honoring the Sabbath day or the Lord's Day at all. Now we've been forced into it. We have to not work as much. And some people are going to fall into the temptation of, I don't know, drink more or other vices, or we can make good use of it and learn something from all this.
You know, Father, that's interesting. The stats are coming out horrifically. I don't know how much American news you see there, but man, the problem isn't the deaths that are coming from the coronavirus per se. It's child abuse is through the roof. Spousal abuse is through the roof, and suicide is through the roof. And it's this massive amount. This takes us back to 1929 when the stock market crashed and people started jumping out of the windows because they saw their life kind of crumbling, you know, on the little ticker that came across the stockbroker's tape. And so, but doesn't that show, like, when you lose your job or you're not able to go to work, and you know you have these economic crises, which are real crises, and it's a real shame, and it's a real suffering, and it's a real purgation. But look how people are handling it. They're taking it out on their children, on their wives, and ultimately on their own eternal, you know, situation for their soul. So, I mean, if anything points to the fact that we don't rest well, it's those kinds of stats right there. We are not handling this corona situation well. Now, I think there will be a resurgence of faith, perhaps. But for those who are less fortunate than, you know, we are perhaps to have these perspectives, man, they're taking it out the wrong way, and you're seeing all that pent up, anxiety exploding simply because they lost a paycheck.
Yeah, it's interesting. Here in Mexico, some of the states have banned the sale of alcohol. And I was kind of confused by that when I saw it. Like, it seems like, you'd want to have a little drink or something if you're locked in your house all day. But someone explained to me the problem is that a lot of the men aren't used to being at home all the time.
Yeah.
And they don't know what to do with themselves. Yeah. And so they become drunkards, and then they commit violence against their family. And so the reaction of the government is, we're going to have to not sell alcohol. Right. Which is a sad commentary on the state of affairs.
Absolutely. So, we're talking about Corona. By the way, what is it like there? I mean, everybody watching this in the States knows what Corona quarantine's like. What is it like there?
It's a bit more relaxed. It's still, in most places, sort of recommendations to stay at home. And thanks be to God, to date, it's a little bit more flexible in terms of what we can do as priests. We're not in total lockdown. However, there's I've been realizing, it's a poorer country here, and the economic effects. Well, there's two things. One, the healthcare system is much poorer here, so when things do get worse, if they get worse here, it could be catastrophic. And secondly, there's so many people here who work for day to day. They don't have savings. It goes back to that mentality we started talking about. They work enough to live, but if they can't work one day, what happens? They don't have anything to feed their family with. So it's going to be bad.
Yeah, absolutely. So on this subject of getting really, really stressed out and not exercising proper Catholic leisure, what are some of the warning signs that you've seen in your ministry where you might look at a friend or a parishioner and you start saying, "Hang on here, you need a little break. You're about to snap. You're boiling up. Your fuse is getting shorter." What are those like warning signs that we should look for in the mirror when we're examining ourselves or our families, so that we don't allow work to push us too far?
I think first of all, if you're not in the habit of resting on the Lord's Day, then that's one indicator, because, as I said, that's our weekly practice, and there's a lot more we could say on that. But I think people who tend to be in that frenzy mode are they're not tranquil, they're not peaceful, so that manifests itself with irritability towards others, right? We don't want to look at our own self, so we get angry more easily at the faults of everybody else. We can't accept with patience and resignation the things that we can't change, because we have this illusion that it all depends on us. And quite frankly, and this is sometimes hard for many people to accept, myself included. We see effects even in our health if we're not taking adequate rest and understanding that we need to be still sometimes.
Maybe it's kind of what I took away from what you were saying is it's sort of like if I'm looking around and saying, why is everybody around me, being so stupid and being such a jerk? That's probably the number one sign. That I'm the one that has a problem. My perspective on everybody is getting worse. And that's probably meaning I'm getting worse. That's probably a good indicator right there.
Yeah, if I can, one thing, because you mentioned before about how do we put ourselves in that leisurely or contemplative disposition. Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that the liturgy is supposed to do that for us, right? And we have a lot of misconceptions nowadays about a certain activism, even in spiritual things.
Have you read my notes? Because I was going to ask you about the difference in the English Mass, the Novus Ordo, and the Latin Mass, which I'm learning more about. And I was going to ask you, hey, seems like I should have a lot more leisure in Latin Mass because I don't understand everything that's going on. But so I'm glad you keep going, but it's right on my notes right here. So go ahead.
Wow. It's divine intervention.
Right.
No, because I was going to say that in the U.S., right, the workaholic attitude has its origins in the Puritan work ethic, right? That comes from a tradition that doesn't really have a contemplative aspect to it. So you say salvation has to identify itself with how busy I am and God's blessings in material things, right? And that trickles down and affects us in so many ways. Whereas the Catholic attitude with the sacraments in particular, right? It's ex opere operato. And so God is the primary operator. We obviously have to prepare ourselves. We have to prepare the soil. But to receive the sacraments, we have to be in a disposition of receptivity, which means you have to put yourself at rest. And what I've been trying to emphasize to people during this time of quarantine, because a lot of people are understandably very upset not being able to go to Mass and everything. I said, no, this is a good opportunity for us to understand a little bit of Catholic theology.
Wow.
That the Mass is for God, and it doesn't depend on whether you're there or not, right? And so the liturgy should elevate us to a contemplative disposition, and I think we can learn a lot.
That's awesome. And, so the Novus Ordo, you understand everything that's being said, and you say a lot more stuff. And, I might have my Latin missal with me, trying to follow along, or the little red cheat sheet book, that I use. A lot of masses have those, pass those out. But because there's a lot more silent moments. And I'm sort of reading along with what the priest is saying, hoping I'm pacing with him properly. And because of just a lot of it, I just don't understand. First off, going to the Latin Mass more and more, it's almost like being a convert. I mean, your eyes are just opened. It's just so much more to learn. It's beautiful. But there has to be a receptivity mindset there, because I'm not able to kind of contribute, I guess, in the same way necessarily that I do with Novus Ordo, but I can unite with, the priest's prayer and the sacrifice spiritually, in just as, or even more so, richer way than I am just because I'm blabbing responses in English and not necessarily thinking about it,
Yeah.
So, I always got kids with me, so Mass is usually not very leisurely. I'm usually trying to make sure that they're not doing something crazy, or we're taking turns holding kids in the back. But, and actually this Corona thing, one of the worst parts for me is just not able to go to daily Mass. We've been, of course, not receiving communion has been really tough for Sundays, but we've been watching Mass on TV, as a family and whatnot, which is certainly, not the same, but,
right.
Not even being able to go to daily Mass, not that I went every day, but I tried to always go a couple times a week. So I can see this. What you're saying is, it's a time where we can appreciate the Catholic theology. Mass is happening. The sacrifice is going on, whether Connor is there in the front pew or not, but I need to try to unite with that. And that's connected to the concept of a true form of Catholic leisure, trying to make a good spiritual communion, as people are talking a lot about now, spiritual communion. I could see that related to the subject of Catholic leisure.
And if you study the ascetical mystical tradition in the church, saints like Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and they describe the whole process in general of advancing in the spiritual life, and how initially we put in our effort. We have to rid ourselves of vices. We have to quiet ourselves. But as we grow in the faith and the mystical experience, God takes more and more of the initiative. And the worst thing we can do if we're advancing in mystical prayer or whatever is try to take hold of it and say, no, I want this nice feeling. And as soon as we try to make it our own, they say that's when God, takes it from us. So he's constantly training us in that restful disposition.
Yeah. So Tan publishes another book. I don't have it on my desk, but Ways of Mental Prayer. And, it really starts with that kind of active prayer, verbal prayer, but then, slowly moves to, the contemplative prayer where we're not doing that much, we're getting much more receptive. And the more I keep that in mind at the liturgy, the better off I am. But the more I do that at work or at home, just living, the more I do that, the better off I am. So I guess that's sort of that receptivity, that passiveness before divine power, omnipotence. I guess that is very closely related to leisure. Now let's get to some practical tips. So the number one thing is, living out the Sunday, the Sabbath day properly. I think that's like the number one thing. But okay, so we go to Mass, or recently we watched Mass on TV. Mm-hmm. And Connor makes sure that he doesn't check too many emails, right? So we do that. But, still, Sunday at my house, I got a bunch of kids, Father, right? So, Sunday for us is not all that different. We still got to make all the meals. We still got to do all the chores and clean the house because we have to do it every day or else it would not be livable. Maybe, we spend some more time in the garden and we sit around outside, but other than me not checking email and working, what else are we supposed to do to embrace a sense of leisure? Do I need to go teach my kids how to play the violin? What else do I do other than not go to work to embrace leisure as a family?
That's a great question, because I think a lot of people are in that situation. They're like, well, this is boring. But if we get bored too easily, well, then we need to cultivate those tastes for more spiritual things, I think. So the church teaches that, first of all, on Sundays and holy days of obligation, when we're supposed to abstain from work, it's servile labor. Okay, so sometimes it's put the work that if we had a servant in the house, those are the jobs we would give to them. Because there are other sorts of works that are refreshing, like gardening or art or things like that, which are different than liberal works, which are liberal in the sense of liberating, like liberal arts. So study, for instance, is always permitted. Reading and things that enrich the mind. So that's a good distinction to keep in mind. And I think in a family, well, the day needs to have as a focal point the family living together as a family, because especially when the kids are older too, everyone can go their own ways, and you might live in the same place, but you don't cross paths so much. So it's to forge those family bonds. Maybe it's as simple as taking time to talk a little bit more, have a discussion. That's a very interesting point, right? How many people today are really incapable of a protracted dialogue on some theme that requires a little bit of mental exertion? They might be able to talk about the weather or sports or whatever, but something like we're doing now is difficult for a lot of people because they're not accustomed to it. So that human interaction is great. Sports or exercise. Yeah. There's a great essay. I think it's Father James Shaw.
Oh yeah.
He's got an essay on this about the value of sports, and of course, in our culture, sports are very exaggerated. So I'm not endorsing the professional sports culture. However, I like his philosophical analogy, because he said when we appreciate sport doesn't exist for something else. We're just enjoying it because there's a goodness to it, right? And I think we see that, you know, if we take time to play with little children or whatever, that they just play. They're not trying to accomplish anything. They're just in the moment. And so if we can live in that moment, the present is kind of analogy of eternity. And that's why God established this rest as the sign of his covenant.
Father, I love your reference to Father Shaw's concept of the essay on sports. I'm very familiar with it. You know, this wasn't planned, right? But I do have a whole chapter in this book on that essay.
Oh, great.
And the chapter is called The 11th Inning. But I write about, a number of years ago, the Cardinals were in the World Series, and it got down to, you know, they hit a home run in the 8th or 9th inning, and they got it back to you know, a tied game. They came back from a losing position multiple times, and each time the home run came, it was ecstatic. It was an unbelievable thing, and this happened multiple times. Well, I had my oldest at the time. He was probably 11 or 12, and in the 6th or 7th inning, he had dozed off. When this stuff started happening, he started waking up, and I remember that moment in the 9th inning, and then the 10th inning, and then the 11th inning. And this little boy was frozen. I mean, he was staring at the screen because every second, every pitch was all about winning or losing the World Series. And I remember looking at him saying, if I could look at God like he's looking at this right now, I'd be a saint. And so Father Shaw's essay that you so wisely brought up, it's talking about how sports fans, when we're enthralled at that moment and we're so engaged, he says in that essay that it's as close as most people ever get to contemplation, because we are just so engaged. And even the Greeks understood this, you know, starting the Olympics, they were outside of their normal everyday problems, and they were so attuned. Their mind, their heart was focused on something, which is sort of what contemplation is. So no, I love that. And I tell you, you know, you gave some great examples, you know, when you got, you know, at home on Sundays, and we try to do so in the evening, sometimes during the work week, you know, if we can get out there for 10 minutes and just shoot hoops a little bit, that goes a long way for creating some peace in the house, to like kind of decompress. It helps me decompress a little bit from the crazy work day. And my kids had crazy days. They had their schooling. They might have had conflict with each other or with mom all day long, or maybe they had conflict with a teacher. But if we're able to just kind of play a little bit, and we're not talking about dumb video games or something, you know, but if we're just able to play outside a little bit, or if we're able to garden and pull some weeds, which my kids see as servile labor, you know, but it's not as servile as they might think. But we also, you know, when the weather's right, we have a lot of bonfires. We roast a lot of, I bet you if I just stopped eating s'mores, I'd lose 10 pounds, you know? So, you know, we do those kinds of things, and we look for those times to sit around, and like you were talking about conversation. So during dinner, Father, something that I try to do is I give the kids difficult moral questions. I throw some kind of crazy question out to them. Maybe it's a political question. You know, should Donald Trump have the right to, you know, quarantine the entire country, or is that left up to the governors? I mean, that's like a political constitutional question. But I try to get everybody from my 18-year-old down to my 8-year-old debating it and talking about it, you know, just going on and on, because I'm trying to get that. I guess I don't really think of it as leisure, but from what you're saying, it sounds like it sort of is. We're rising our minds and hearts to something beyond just ourselves and engaging with each other in some kind of joyful way, even if it's an argument, a good, wholesome argument. So anyway, I see that everything you're saying is spot on, just from my experience with all these little kids, and I suspect it's the same for priests and a priestly fraternity as well. I would think.
And the kind of work or activity we can do, I think we can distinguish it and say, you know, if we're working or engaged in an activity that tends towards the production of beauty, then it has a contemplative aspect, right? Because beauty fascinates us, and that's when we can sit and be still. And there's I forget the author now, a book I just read called Beauty for Truth's Sake, right? Mm. So contemplation is beholding God, who is truth, right? And it's beauty that pulls us to that makes it attractive, right? And so we get a sense of what it means to be at rest and contemplative. If you've gone to the beach and you just can sit there and watch the waves roll in, or an interesting observation. I travel a lot, right? And I'm still fascinated looking out the window on the plane, and just seeing the clouds and you see that in kids, but it always amazes me how many people get on the plane and immediately shut the thing and put their headphones in, and like, you're not moved by this?
Right.
There's something amiss in your soul if you can't be still for a moment and say, wow, that's pretty awesome.
No, that's exactly right. And when I, as a dad, when I see my kids sitting at their little desk, we got this little classroom for homeschooling, and when I see the little guys coloring a picture or drawing a picture, it just lights me up, because, and I don't really think about it as leisure, but it is, and as opposed to them watching TV, they're doing something that is proactive, that is leading towards beauty, which leads towards truth and goodness. And so but I think every parent would rather see, no matter how much media consumption of mom or dad does themselves, there's something in them that knows it's better for the kid to draw a picture than to play a video, right? It's just, so some of this stuff must be like the natural law written on our heart. We know what raises us and our children up, and we notice it a lot more when we're thinking about our kids than ourselves. That's my experience.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And so what about TV? What about TV, Father? That's a biggie, right? Or Netflix. We used to talk about cable, but okay. I confess to Almighty God and to all of you in cyberspace that one of my favorite times of the day is after we've done all the chores and, it's been a long day and we've had a nice dinner and the house is cleaned up, plopping on the couch. Well, we usually say the rosary after all that's done. But after that rosary, it's like sometimes it's a race to turn on Netflix and we watch something as a family. It's never like, hey, mom and dad are going to watch something and the kids go somewhere else. No, we watch something we can all watch together.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that can go, run amok. But everybody that's listening to the topic of leisure is going to wonder about TV, Netflix.
TV.
So help us out with that.
Well, and maybe it starts to get a little controversial, or it might be some differences of opinion. I think that there's always going to be different levels of leisure, right? Like sometimes we need to just sit back and gel for a little bit, but that shouldn't dominate, because our leisure should edify us in some way. So that goes into the selection of what we're going to watch, and the proportions, right? There's an interesting philosophical question there too, because the different sorts of entertainment have different effects on our soul. And I remember in class we took, we analyzed, for instance, the problem with a lot of modern entertainment is that it dulls the imagination.
Yeah.
The story's not as profound. Even the way of production is many flashing scenes, and so especially if that predominates and children aren't accustomed to reading and seeing real works of art and everything, their imagination never develops, and then they're incapable of producing that beauty or recognizing that beauty that's part of that contemplative outlook, right?
If you're watching TV, like if you're watching the movie of Lord of the Rings, which we love that movie, but if you're watching it, you're seeing Peter Jackson's imagination at work, which kind of stops my imagination from working.
Yeah, and it's not. I'm not one to be so extreme as to say that's bad. Like that we need to be Amish.
Right.
But
I am not Amish.
It needs to be. We need to have moderation in all things. So if there's a little casual entertainment, that's great. But it needs to be. We need to be able to recognize what's a classic and have an appreciation for real art and real literature, and not just watch cartoons all day
Yeah.
and not have that aspect of our minds developed.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, the TV situation it's always hard, Father, because especially with a bunch of kids, you're trying to find something that'll make everybody quiet down,
Yeah.
and you're worn out, and then, you even things that are PG, okay, they can take the Lord's name in vain countless times. There can be immodesty galore.
Yeah.
I mean, PG doesn't mean anything. So we always have to kind of go and look at different reviews online about shows and stuff to see, what the sexual content is, what the language content is. There's a lot of great services that kind of break that out for you. But I mean, look, I guess my point is I'm agreeing with you. Some level of media entertainment can be appropriate, but it's hard work for mom and dad. I can tell you that they gotta work hard to make sure they're not channel surfing and they're not exposing their kids to anything that's obviously harmful or obviously themselves.
Yeah.
Placing it in the proper context can be okay, but there is so much more to do, whether it's play a board game or, have a fire outside like I was talking about. There's so many other things that people can do. And families are a little scared of just sitting around outside at night and talking because they're so used to having that media consumption at that time.
And everybody being on their cell phones at the same time, if they are sitting around
I know. Yeah.
the table, it's dangerous.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
I think you mentioned the book Leisure: The Basis of Culture.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too to bring that together, right? The connection not only for the individual soul, but the importance of that leisurely attitude for forming a culture. Because I think it's obvious that we don't have a very healthy culture. And if we compare cultures around the world, some are still more traditional, more or healthier than others. But culture leisure is necessary for building a culture, because what do we define as that? What defines a culture? It's art, it's music, it's food. Things.
You are cultured, and it usually refers to those kinds of things.
But they all have an artistic aspect to it, which requires leisure in order to be able to contemplate the beauty and then try to reproduce it or magnify it is the proper role of art. But the other thing, and Joseph Pieper points this out, right? The root of the word culture is cult, not in the bad sense like the Branch Davidians or whatever, but worship. And so all our efforts to produce beauty, all our efforts to rest and be contemplative have to lead us to that the most perfect act a man can do which is worship God, right? Wow. Join himself to the worship of God. And so a healthy culture has that orientation. An unhealthy culture creates falsifications of beauty that worship oneself, put oneself in the place of divinity instead of putting God in his place.
Wow, that's amazing. I've never considered or don't remember considering culture basically kind of saying that's what people are worshiping. What is that cult? What is that thing that the people as a whole are striving after? And that's going to give me a new sense of what I say, like our culture's messed up. It's because we're worshiping the wrong things, and that ties us back full circle to being workaholics, because that can be a false god. I mean, your job, and I'm kind of a hard charging guy. I mean, I don't like jump into stuff unless I'm gonna go at it hard, and it can be a false god. And so I can see that, and I've known older people who have said that very thing. So who have said if I had worked a little less intensely and a little bit more wisely and relied on God a lot more, probably just as much would have gotten done. But even if it didn't, I would have been better off. So, at 40 years old, I'm trying to remember that, and my dad always told me that stress is cumulative, right? I mean, it builds up over time. And not only does it build up over time, but it sort of eats away at your soul. If you're not cultivating that artistic appreciation for beauty, raising your mind towards God throughout your kind of daily life, especially on Sundays with your family. I mean, I could see you just growing into a bitter old man, kind of like Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge, you know, who lost all sense of beauty, you know, for everything around him, which is largely what Charles Dickens' point was. In fact, it's a great little story. But, you know, so Father, this has been so helpful. Now, one last question before we depart today. You know, tell us just real quickly, how might we? I'm finding in my life that I think about something like culture, like leisure, and I kind of try to think my way through it, which is fine, but I don't always pray my way through it. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you to give, especially the families here that are watching this, because a lot of the people watching this will be moms and dads, and with kids or jobs, I mean, all these kind of practical worldly concerns. How do we pray about leisure? How do we pray our way into developing the right habits as opposed to just thinking our way through it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think first of all, it's good to put all our preoccupations, all the things that can stress us and inhibit being restful, we need to put them in prayer, right? So we need to be invoking God's help in those things, so that we start to generate a consciousness that we can't do it all ourselves, and we need Him to help us, and He's going to be much better at it anyway. The practice of mental prayer is something that I think so many Catholics neglect. They're not trained in how to do it. And they might think that that's something, either have an image of Protestants who like to freelance or freestyle the prayers.
Right.
You know, a Catholic needs to just recite his prayers, or just for mystics. So, but Saint Teresa of Avila says that, you know, he who doesn't practice mental prayer won't be saved. You know, so we need to. There's different degrees, obviously, but we need to be able to spend 5 or 10 minutes just letting God talk and understand that's possible. And then, as you know, we started out talking about the relationship between sloth and hope. Yeah. So the virtue of hope. So I think we need to cultivate a lot more consciousness as Catholics of the role of the theological virtues, because they're the virtues that link us directly to God. And unlike the other virtues that depend on our own actions to build them up, these ones are infused in us. So that's the receptivity. So we should pray an act of hope every day or multiple times a day, where we profess that we know that God's called us to be saints, and that He's not going to neglect us in any way. He's given us all the tools we need. We just have to abandon ourselves to that.
Well, that'll help guide my prayers in the near future. And so you've helped shape a lot of thoughts, given us a lot of food for thought. And you know, my prayers will change a little bit here. I'm going to be asking God to help me figure out how to rest. You know, how do I, Lord? You know, I've prayed for all kinds of things, but I don't think I've ever prayed for proper leisure. So I think I'm going to go pray for it, you know, and hopefully that mental prayer, if I can do it, you know, will lead us to that. But thank you, Father, very much. Let me ask you, are you able to give some kind of cyberspace blessing?
Sure.
All right, we'll take it.
Okay. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, descendat super vos et maneat semper. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
You, Father. God bless your ministry. Thanks so much for being here. And please come back sometime and help us with gaining some more wisdom like you did today. Thank you, Father.
My pleasure. God bless you.